let's say, first of all, I'm a philosopher, and I do some social sciences, but basically I think that I have stick to philosophy. I stick to philosophy in my method, in my way of tackling questions, and I was very interested in epistemology in general, so in questions about knowledge. And at a certain point in the early 2000s, internet became such a major phenomenon that I started to be interested in what were the transformations of the way in which we organize and we access and we produce and distribute knowledge that were dependent on the introduction of the internet in our lives. And so I was very interested in the question of trust. Why? It seems like a paradox. We philosophers, the traditional view of knowledge in philosophy, in epistemology, is that you should not trust. You should be an autonomous thinker. So you should have in your own mind the means to filter information and to infer new knowledge from what you already know, without taking into account the opinion of others. The opinion of others is doxa, and episteme, the true knowledge, is the opposite. I mean, being an autonomous being, being an autonomous knower. And with internet and with this also hyperconnectivity in which knowledge started to spin around as faster than light. I mean, I had the feeling that trust was becoming a very important aspect of the way in which we acquire knowledge. So that we need to trust other people. We need to trust in an information-dense society in which you have so much information, you cannot just count on your own means. I mean, you need to trust other people. And what does it mean to trust them? What does it mean? Does it mean to become gullible? Does it mean to become credulous? So I started to really work in some specific domains and try to understand what does it mean to trust other people in order to acquire knowledge, to acquire some reliable information. What do we do? Are we entitled to do this? Is this a sort of appropriate way of using our mind, of doing inference? So I ended up with some interesting, let's say more empirical research and researchers, and also with some interesting normative claims about when are we entitled to trust? When are we rational in using our trust, or when are we gullible? I mean, and these are cases that there are heuristics, that there are biases, there are very different. Different circumstances in which we can be more or less gullible. And I think that in general in my research, which mixes up a very sort of French way of thinking social sciences and philosophy, and a more analytical and Anglo-Saxon approach. So given that I'm a foreigner, in a sense, I'm a foreign everywhere. I have the privilege of, I can mix up all the possible traditions without feeling that I'm sort of contaminating myself. So this is a big freedom to be, not to belong to any place. I'm an Italian, I live in France. I have studied analytical philosophy and cognitive science in France. And then I was exposed, by living in Paris, to the French culture. So I feel quite free to use Foucault and Darwin in the same in the same article without feeling like intimidated by some sort of disciplinary boundaries or ideological boundaries. So that was for me. It was maybe more difficult sometimes to be heard, but it was a big freedom for me to be able to use any possible corpus of knowledge with a lot of personal freedom, which is an important value for me. And so I started to mix up different literature and try to understand in some domains how really we make sense of our trust in a domain. For example, take the academic domain, the academic field. That was perfect because it is my field. I work in the academy. I am a researcher at the Centre National de la Recherche Scientifique, the CNRS in Paris. So, and also there is a tradition in sociology in France to take academy as an example to be self-reflexive. I mean, having social scientists who reflect upon academy, and most notably Pierre Bourdieu, who has been a very influential sociologist in France, worked on how the academy works, how the credibility of knowledge in the academy is created. So I started to work on this, and I discovered many interesting things. I mean, many biases, and the fact that basically we don't trust. So basically, in general, we have two kinds of constraints. In my work, I'm interested in explaining and in interpreting these two kinds of constraints on how we make sense of a certain corpus of knowledge. One kind of constraints are structural constraints on that corpus of knowledge. We know, for example, that academic publications are a network of citations. And so citation networks have certain structural properties. Like, for example, citation networks had the tendency of being aristocratic, which means that rich get richer. The more citation you receive, the more you will receive in the future. That is an effect of the networks. So it doesn't have anything to do with your will, with your cognitive system. It is just how the network is organized. So this is one kind of constraints that I'm very interested in analyzing in my work. This is a very well known. It was the famous American sociologist Robert Merton, who was teaching in Columbia University, who called this effect the Matthew effect. In the New Testament, the text, you have 4 texts from John, Matthew, I don't remember and Matthew says, well, the rich will have more and the poor will have less. And so Merton called this Matthew effect in order to describe citation networks and academic prestige. So if you're prestigious in academia, you will have more prestige. And if you're just marginal, the tendency will be that you will be the more and more marginal. So these kind of effects are structural effects that depend on the shape of the network. And for example, another network that works in this way is the network we were talking about, is PageRank. PageRank is an aristocratic network. So it has the tendency to prize the people who are on the top. And you have other kind of networks which are sadly very democratic, like, for example, illness, epidemics, the way in which contagion is very democratic. It's not aristocratic, so everybody can be contagious by everybody else. So the shape of a network, of a phenomenon, is very important to understand the structural constraints of this phenomenon. So when we were talking before, like, PageRank and then Facebook or eBay, I think that all these networks are a little different. Their structural constraints are different, so you can have predictions on who go up and down in these different networks, according also to by taking into account also to the constraints. On the other hand, you have our minds. I mean, and you have all the constraints on the way in which we tackle knowledge and we deal with a corpus of knowledge that has to do with our biases, with our heuristics, also with our previous knowledge, and the fact that we are going to privilege some information. And we have an enormous literature today on this kind of cognitive biases, like all the work of Daniel Kahneman, you were mentioning Gerd Gigerenzer, and so many other people in behavioral economics and in social psychology and cognitive psychology, so in very different domains, which have made us aware of the enormous number of biases that we have when we deal with a certain phenomenon that can distort the way in which we perceive the phenomenon. So on the other hand, so my idea is that if you want to understand what knowledge is and what can we extract in a sort of reliable way from this complex bundle of information that invades us, we have to deal with these two aspects: the cognitive constraints on the way in which we perceive a certain corpus of knowledge, and on the other hand, and also the heuristics and also the mistakes that we make. And on the other hand, the structural constraints that exist on the corpus. This is not a sort of I don't end up being a constructivist or relativistic about knowledge. I mean, I don't end up saying, well, everything is constructed by the structural knowledge is constructed by our psychological biases and by the structural constraints of a certain network or a certain organization of knowledge. I end up with a sort of so I'm not a skeptic about knowledge, but I think that the way in which we pack things, the way in which we construct our let's say knowledge institutions in general matters a lot in order to understand what will be filtered as knowledge in a certain time span, in a certain era for a certain society. I think it is very important to know the constraints. Also, there is a sort of normative part of my work in which I think that people should be aware of some of the heuristics, some of the biases they have in reading information in such a informational dense environment like internet. And this is something that could be good also for education, etc. So we tend to trust things and chunks of information sometimes on the basis of very poor heuristics. And this is something that can be easily corrected in a sense, like, for example, just by teaching children to look at the URL, where does the information, how the URL is written. It contains a lot of information about the reliability of the site. It is something that you should be able to do it automatically. So I insist a lot in my work, and which is basically still, I mean, even if I like field work in social science, but I mix up, epistemology and social science. Actually, my domain in academic terms is called social epistemology, how the constraints, the social constraints have an influence on our way of processing knowledge. So I think that my own method in social epistemology has been in the last, let's say, 6 or 7 years, and it was very influenced by the huge impact of the advent of the society of information, by try to developing a sort of second-order epistemology. What do I mean with second-order epistemology? So instead of first-order epistemology tells you, well, in order to distinguish knowledge, to pry apart knowledge from just belief, you need to check some constraints on a chunk of information, like is it logically structured in the appropriate way? What are the inferential consequences that they can draw from that chunk of information. Are these consequences, for example, are they contradicting previous knowledge? So if they are, well, just be careful, etc. So this is first order epistemology. You try to check the reliability of a chunk of information by some method, which are classical logic. Many theories we have developed in the history of thought in order to check the reliability of information, all the scientific method. And second order epistemology is like sort of something that we need today, given that you cannot check anymore these details on the very chunk of information. You can check indirect reliability of the information, like its authority, its reputation, where does it come from, who said that, which is the strength or the weight the person who has said this thing gives to that chunk of information. All this is something new. We have a very sort of spontaneous reaction to ways of attributing authority to other people. Well, this must be an authoritative guy, for example, because he's on the edge side, or maybe he's not. I mean, or whatever. I mean, so we have very automatic, but we have a lot of intuition about how to assess this sort of indirect index of reliability. And in my work, I try to make this intuition a little more controllable. I mean, I try to see how these intuitions sometimes are just wrong and really hopeless, and sometimes they can use as heuristics in order to get information. Take, for example, there are many examples. For example, take the reputation of doctors. This is one of the most interesting examples that I like to cite. Everybody, I don't know if it is the same in the United States, it is surely, it is a fact in France and in Italy that if you ask to someone about his or her doctor, he will reply that it is the best doctor in town. Everybody has the best doctor, which is clearly paradoxical because we can't have all the best doctors. And the way in which we select doctors is very mysterious because you don't have explicit ratings of doctors. I mean, you have websites now that rate the doctors, but all this is very... health is a very sensitive issue. You give trust to someone for many, many different reasons. So, but in the end, everybody end up being convinced to have the best doctor, which is, so I try to understand why. What are the routine, what are the heuristics, what are the biases that make us react in this way? So, for example, when you are in a very weak position, you attribute a higher weight to authority, which should be the opposite in a sense. I mean, if you're in a weak position, like it's your health that is, you should be more careful. I mean, whereas the routine that we use is exactly the opposite. And there are many of these biases that we use every day in order to allocate authority to some sources of information, like, for example, the proximity bias is something that I have studied, like just because someone is next to someone else, he receives, like, as the aura, the reputation of the more important person leaks and illuminates in light also the other person. So there is a sort of halo effect of transmission of authority from one person to another, which is of course, I mean, you can justify in some ways why two people who are next to each other must share some sort of authority, but I mean, in many cases, this can bring us to sort of very negative conclusions. So, that is basically what interests me. In order, I mean, the double question of understanding our own biases, but also understanding what is the potential of using this in an appropriate way, this indirect information and this indirect cues of quality, of reputation, in order to navigate this enormous amount of knowledge. And that is also something that we discussed previously on the Edge site about well, what is interesting about internet and especially about the web is that the internet is not only an enormous reservoir of information, it is a reputational device, means that it accumulates tons of evaluations of other people, and so the information you get, it is pre-treated, I mean, it's pre-evaluated, and this makes you go much faster. And this is an evolutionary heuristics that we have. I mean, that we have probably since the birth of the human mind. I mean, follow the people who know how to treat information. So don't go yourself for the solution. Follow those who have the solution. And this is a super strong drive to learn faster. Children know very well this drive. And of course, it can bring you to conformism and have very negative side effects, but also can bring you. It makes you know faster. This is clear. So we know faster, not because there is a lot of information around. We know faster because the information that is around is evaluated. It is has a reputational sort of label on it. I think that my interest in social epistemology, in a sense, is related to my previous interest, and I'm still very interested in cognitive science and in philosophy of cognitive science and cognitive epistemology also. And I think it is just a transition because the collective dimension of our knowledge is so huge that you need to know how the social aspect of our life, how the social structures are organized. I mean, the way it doesn't. So our mind is a piece of a puzzle in which there are many minds, and that are connected in many different ways. And but basically, the way in which we are connected is not like in a brain, a neuron connected to a neuron, but we are connected through social networks. That was just an empirical evidence. When internet started in the 90s, but there were a lot of metaphors around what the internet is. What is this bundle of links? What is the connectivity? And one was the brain. I mean, maybe we can use the connectionist models of the brain in order to understand how internet works and how it develops, because it was growing. And that was a possibility, and we were all very excited about, because we were working in cognitive science and neuroscience, philosophy of neuroscience, and in the end, in 2000, the mathematician John Kleinberg just had a result, I mean, which was published on Science, and he showed that the internet is a social network, like the social network that we have of people who we invite to cocktail parties, or social networks in our work environment. We live in a lot of many different social networks, and he showed in 1999 actually, and the article was out in 2000, that the internet is a social network. So wow, in those years, Brin and Page, they were students in Stanford. They took his idea to design PageRank. which was designed exactly as a social network. It means you have hubs, you have 3 levels, you have all the possible nodes of the network, let's say the sites, the websites. Then you have authorities, which are the sort of a middle layer of nodes that is more authoritative. What does it mean in terms of social network? That it receives a lot of, let's say, a lot of entries, and these authorities point to some of the website, and they make them go up. So what is special about this? It seems very banal, but I mean the structure is the structure of the social network, and what is important is to explain, what was important for them, it was to explain that there is a huge difference in terms of authority and ranking between a link from the web page of Gloria Origi to the web page of Harvard University, and vice versa, a link of the web page of Harvard University toward the page of Gloria Origi. If Harvard points, which is an authority, points toward me, it makes me go up a lot. If I point to, I put a link to Harvard, my weight is not enough to put, I mean, it doesn't make such a difference. So this sort of asymmetry of the network was, which doesn't exist in the brain exactly. So it was another model. That's why I decided in the early 2000s to move towards social sciences and try to take them seriously. So when people discuss about trust, even in philosophy, etc., I wanted to understand what the social scientists treat, how the social scientists treat this notion, how, what is the research around, so it was really a transition for me, and I think I was right, because we are facing this phenomena, a big change also in the business life, in which trust, reputation become commodities that we can exchange and we can trade, like take websites like eBay or Airbnb. It's a sort of reputational. You have to have a good reputation in order to take part of this exchange of houses, apartments, etc. And so these are so important. But what does it mean? So my question was, what does it mean? What does it mean to have a good reputation, for example? What does it mean? Does it mean that, what does it mean in general to have a reputation? What do I lose? I mean, it's not like having a toothache. What do I lose when I lose a reputation? I mean, I am exactly, what did Volkswagen lose when it apparently lost its reputation a month ago because of a scandal about the construction of some devices in order to trick the ecological controls? Well, what did Volkswagen lose? So this is an important question. What is reputation? How can you count? Is it just only social information, as it seems to be like on websites like eBay? On eBay, reputation is purely social information. It means that you gather evaluation from the social group, and it changes your position in this social dynamics. So makes you going up and down. But is it the same with the likes, for example? What does it mean to like something on Facebook? How can you count the likes? What are you doing when you're trying to I don't know, when you retouch your pictures on Facebook or try to have a better reputation than your actual one online, etc. So these phenomena are not so. I mean, everybody's talking about reputation. How is it important today to e-reputation, to have a good reputation, etc. But very few people just try to understand what's there. I mean, what's there, given that reputation doesn't exist. Reputation doesn't exist. It's not like money. It's not like headaches. It's just doesn't exist. It exists because someone attributes you to a reputation. It is a total social property. Philosophers talk about Cambridge properties that can change things in your life, but they don't exist. I mean, like, for example, so you can even, you can also not be aware about having or not having a reputation. So in a sense, we are becoming super aware of our own reputation, and we are excited by the fact that we have so many devices today that can leave us a freedom of manipulation of reputation. We can manipulate our own reputation by, by using by using in a strategic way, let's say, the social web. And on the other hand, the more freedom we have in dealing with our own reputation, the more freedom other people have to manipulate our own reputation, to do things with what we have done. So the problem of reputation, for example, you find many definitions. Basically in economics, there is a very little literature in social sciences about reputation. And I have tried to go through and try to understand where reputation was. I mean, you have the notion of social capital, which is a little related to, but it is not exactly the same. So the problem with reputation is that it is not only the opinion of others, but it is what you think the opinion of others is. So it's something that it is a little more complex. And this is to go back to the relation between what I have studied in my life, like cognitive science and philosophy of cognition and social science. So I think that many phenomena that are interesting today deal with how our own minds deal with the social world. And this is exactly, so you have to be aware of how our minds are structured, but also have to be aware about how the social world is structured. So reputation is not what the opinion of others, as the sort of basic economic model of reputation will tell you, but it is what do you think it is the opinion of others, which makes things a lot more complex and makes of reputation a cognitive, social-cognitive phenomenon, if you want. And also, what is special of reputation in this era, in this particular social configuration of societies which are invaded by social networks and technology of communication. It is that reputation is a communicative phenomenon. It's something that we transmit. And sometimes we are so eager to transmit an information that it is even more interesting to, so we look at, we find an article, a newspaper article, something that we feel that can be interesting, and instead of reading it, we just forward to someone else or put it on Facebook. So the willingness to communicate, to transmit information is stronger than the willingness to acquire information, which is also a very special phenomenon, a very strange. You should say, well, I am an interested, self-interested guy, girl, sort of an instance of the Homo economicus. So I find a piece of information which is interesting. Well, I keep it for me. Well, I keep it for me. So why should I share? And we all know today the common behaviors. You find something interesting, you share it before reading it. So what does it mean? What does it mean in terms of cognitive science and social science? So it means that some social configurations that are around today, that are made by social institutions, technologies, etc., make function some parts of our brain highlight some dispositions of our brain in a special way. So probably we have this disposition of sharing information immediately, which was less exploited by other social configurations, like, I don't know, the way in which knowledge and information used to circulate 50 years ago, and which is highlighted and sort of, which is made more, more explicit by this social configuration. So things are there in our mind, probably all the competence we have in order to deal with the information around are there. And then some social configurations, which are complex devices that put together politics, economics, the way in which social institutions stabilize cultural phenomena, etc. So technology, the development of technology, these sort of big and complex devices change from one generation to another. Some are more stable, some change very, very, very rapidly. And in a sense, they can foster some of our cognitive competences and conceal some others for a while and then change. So that's why I'm so interested in the interplay between these two dimensions. I think that also the communication between cognitive sciences and social sciences is easy today, is a little easier today because of the adoption by a group of social scientists today of experimental methods, which is quite new, which is something that was not around in some other traditions of social sciences. But I still I come from philosophy studies and from humanities studies, so I have a humanities background and I'm very attached to it. And I think that all the possible all the possible cultural traditions. We have an enormous privilege in these times. Everything is available. Everything you can have a look to, and everything can be sort of remixed in a sense. Every part of the culture, from literature to mathematics and astrophysics and pop music, can be sort of repacked in a new way in order to see phenomena that you cannot see just within only one discipline. So I'm very attached to a sort of pluralistic method of working. This is the way in which I work. I also write literature in Italy, so I'm very attached to this sort of creative dimension of mixing up traditions and things. So, but I think also that today the way in which a part of social science try to tackle with some phenomena is more compatible with the experimental tradition. So it is easy to communicate. There are traditions in social sciences like economics and part of sociology, which are highly formalized, that they use models. And this is not just poetry. Models can predict something, etc. But what I find interesting today is that you can talk to people who use models and try to say, well, this is an interesting prediction. Can we just test it experimentally? And this is something that is also very creative. It mixes up so many different competences. Take what I'm working on in these days. I mean, I have the feeling, and this is an intuition, and of course I have written about it, but I mean, that we tend to evaluate better, not only to prefer, but to evaluate better, to give a better reputation to people who reciprocate a little bit. So to people who like us, at least a little bit. Pure reputational free riders who want to go up in the hierarchies and never reciprocate, we are suspicious. Well, we can adore them. At a certain point, we let them down. So there are models in social sciences which formalize this way in which hierarchies are created. I mean, people who go up, why a person goes up in a hierarchy? Because many people defer to this person. So the idea is that you have many people below and one people up, as in, I don't know, Twitter. You have, if you're an important person on Twitter, you have many followers, and but you don't follow so many people. I mean, you have, but the idea that is, is around in some literature, and I want to test, is that you prefer those who reciprocate a little bit. So you defer to them, but they also defer a little bit to them. So this is an adjustment that we do. Like for example, take when I try to submit a paper, an article, to a super high ranked academic journal. Like in my domain, there are mine. I don't know. There are the most high-ranked academic journal in philosophy, and I am rejected. Well, I submit a second time. My paper is rejected, and at a certain point, as we all do in our business in academy, you try with a less prestigious journal. And then you're at a certain point down in the hierarchy, you find a journal which publishes you. And at that point, sometimes people start to adjust, say, well, this journal is not so bad as people say. I mean, there are many interesting things. In a sense, it's much more accessible. I think that the standards of those guys up are becoming a little obsolete. And so that's a way in which, hierarchies are adjusted. We adjust a lot in order to prefer those whom we think are going to prefer us. So this is something which is, it exists in some sort of formal model of social sciences. It exists in the study of hierarchies, very formal study of hierarchies. It hasn't been tested. So I'm just testing it with a student. I'm following, I'm a philosopher. I'm not such a, there is now a small tradition of experimental philosophers, and in my lab, hopefully in Paris, there are many experimental philosophers, so people who take philosophical questions and try to test them experimentally. And so we have a lot of fun. Sometimes it is important to say, and this is really the spirit of also the experimental work, which is an enormous fun, is sometimes you're wrong. Sometimes your intuitions are completely wrong. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe now we are testing it. Maybe we will discover that people just don't care to be reciprocated. And that is important because we also have this now this self-evident authority of science. Scientists have said that so-and-so. Okay, scientists have said that so-and-so, but for one positive result that you find published in an academic journal, you have tons of negative results that are in the symmetry of our labs and that are very interesting too. So in a sense, in my approach is just don't think that the truth is just only there is a special place in which it is, and the more modest you are, and the more pluralistic you are, the better it is for research. So that's the way in which I avoid any possible prejudice, and that is also because of my background. I have a very mixed background. I have studied formal logic and Nietzsche and Husserl in my undergraduate studies. Then I made I studied cognitive science in Paris, And I always moved around, so I think that it is very important to keep your mind open. I write literature, and I write a lot for newspapers in Italian, because it was my way to keep contact with my own mother tongue. Europe is a very different situation from United States. We are 27 countries with 27 languages. I work sometimes in Brussels as an expert in advisory boards, etc. And in order to start a conversation, you have to wait for the greetings in 27 languages, in 27 different languages. So I have so Europe is a very different scene in which difference, in a sense, trying to keep your difference is something that is important for us. I don't know, keeping your tradition. We pay an enormous price. I think a too high price in Europe for protecting our folklore, in a sense. But it is true that I have studied humanities and formal logic in my youth. I mean, when I was at university in Milano, which was a very good place, and we didn't have this idea that there was science in one on one side and let's say cultural studies on the other side. We had this idea to be, we thought it would have been able to navigate the sort of culture and navigate science with the same boat, whereas it happened to be very difficult even in Europe. Cultural studies have been a big disappointment. In a sense, a sort of vulgarization of the values of humanities, which I still think is very important in education. And on the other hand, scientific methods were perceived as a way of dominating, a sort of a tool of domination, let's say, a tool of dominating the discourse, the public, the scientific, the discourse about truth. There is a famous piece on this, which was the inaugural lecture of Michel Foucault at the Collège de France, which is a wonderful text, which is called The Order of Discourse, in which he tries to argue that, you should be careful when you use a certain discourse, can be the scientific discourse, the literary discourse, the political discourse, who is controlling it in a sense. So the scientific discourse was seen not as a tool for thought, but a tool for domination. And that was also because the relationship between power and science has changed a lot in the last 20 years. And we should be frank about this. I mean, this is in Europe. I don't know what is the scene in the United States, but I mean, we have a the political dimension of research, what is research, what we researchers are doing, has become important. States display their reputation through their scientific research. They want to be present in the international rankings. They want to be. They compete for prestige and for prestige, and also they compete for innovation. So we were a community like, I don't know, 20 or 30 years ago in an ivory tower in which doing research and using the scientific method was something very independent of the, in a sense, the real world was. And now, I mean, we are pushed on producing some research that is useful for, of course, I mean, the resources are scarce, so we need to, and that has changed a little bit the vision, I mean, and sort of a positive vision of science as a free, an activity of freedom that researchers used to have like 20 years ago. And so I think that also the political dimension, at least in Europe, the way in which the political discourse has entered the scientific discourse has changed a little bit the atmosphere and the way in which. But that's why I think, I mean, we, in a sense, people hate. Yeah, serious people hate postmodernism because yeah, it was a sort of laissez-faire. Everything can be said in a sense, and so I don't want to defend postmodernism. I just want to say something provocative about this, and that we are in a postmodern era. Our knowledge is structurally postmodern, which means that there are no more clear filters, that are no more clear canons or what is high and what is low. This gives us an enormous cacophony of possible ways of dealing with culture and knowledge, but also an enormous freedom of methods. I mean, freedom of methods. You can find things, you can mix I don't know, literature with big data. We have a freedom that we didn't really have 20 or 30 years ago. So in a sense, of course, we are more uncertain about the results of research, but I think that at least in the intellectual debate, we should avoid polarizations. Whereas we see the political debate is so polarized. In the intellectual debate, we should be pluralistic. I mean, let's be pluralistic. I mean, we can access knowledge in so many different ways, and we don't know which was going to be the one who was going to change the world.